Well, you mentioned earlier that you noticed as a result of your ministry through Courage and Exodus, that the people who found the most peace, the most contentment, the most psychological wholeness were those who'd settled down in a monogamous gay relationship. But along the way, in order to do that, they'd lost their faith.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, Jeremy, how has your journey affected your faith?
Well, I think there must have been enough positives in my Christian faith to see that following Christ really is still the best thing. Even if we have to change our minds about lots of things, it still is the most wonderful good news at its best when presented and lived out at its best. So I think I saw the fact of people losing their faith as a great tragedy, and as a pastor, basically, I felt that if people were losing their faith, then I had to find out what it was that was causing them to lose their faith. And if it was the struggle with their sexuality being too great, then we needed to change our minds about this. And indeed, I'm thrilled to say that a great many of those people who felt they'd lost their faith before are now back with us, worshipping and taking part in our meetings and are connected with us. And although their faith has been damaged, they now that in a sense I've been able to model the possibility of them reconciling the faith and sexuality, they now can look back and think, well, nobody was there to give me the missing piece of the jigsaw, so I couldn't sustain the two. But now that I can begin to see the whole picture, and that God loves me as a gay man, or a woman as a lesbian woman, without tolerating but rather fully embracing us as such, then I can therefore worship God again. So it's been lovely to see quite a lot of people recover a faith that had been lost and mature in that faith.
And you yourself, you married and you've remained committed to your wife in your marriage relationship. How do you advise people generally who can look back and think, well, yeah, I am gay, I've always known I'm gay, but I'm also in a heterosexual marriage?
Right. Well, perhaps I ought to debunk another myth here, that often people think that I'm advising people what to do, and most of the time I'm not doing any advising but just listening, and sometimes sharing my own thoughts and experience, of course. But particularly for married couples, I always believe that they have made a commitment to one another in the sight of God, and therefore the husband and the wife are the only two people really who can decide what they want to do in the light of the recognition that the husband or the wife is gay. I mean, we do also see lesbian women who are married who perhaps hadn't even realised they were lesbian for years, and then it's dawned on them that this was the case, and then they've started asking questions, and all I have to do really is to listen to their journey and help them to pick out the elements that are really important, of which their love for their spouse is a very important part, and therefore they then got to work out what's the most loving thing to do here. I mean, if they've got a grown-up family who've left the home and they're now freer to decide what they're going to do with the rest of their lives, it's a little easier for them then to contemplate separation if that's appropriate. And often couples find that very releasing, to feel they could at last be themselves and move on. But it's not something I could ever advise, and there are others like myself who have remained in their marriages and want to do so for other reasons, and I fully support that too. But at least coming to terms with the fact of being gay is a big step forward, because you're not trying to fight yourself all the time. You're at least recognising what is true, even though there may not be an avenue for expression of that specifically, other than in fellowship with other gay Christians.
And what about wives? Have you had wives of gay partners who've spoken to you, and then what would you say to them? You may not advise them in terms of continuing or not, but how can you advise them generally?
Yes, well, yes, I do know quite a few wives of gay husbands. I have to admit, in most instances, I've met them incidentally because their husbands have come for help. In fact, in the earlier days, the wives might have said, you need to go to Courage and get yourself sorted out, which is very often how they thought, because they thought, well, I don't have a problem here, it's my husband who has the problem, so he needs to take responsibility for getting it sorted out. And when he's got himself sorted out, then we can get on with having a normal married life. But sadly, this, of course, is not a realistic proposition, and many wives become immensely angry with their husbands for having this problem and feel very betrayed, especially if he's acted out on it. And so you then have some very real additional pastoral problems, because I sometimes have had to say to those wives, if you allow yourself to just stay in a very angry, embittered place where you see your husband as the enemy who's betrayed you, then not only would there be no hope for your marriage to recover, but it'll also have very serious effects on you as a person, carrying all that bitterness and anger. You're going to have to some point deal with that and come to accept what is true, and then decide from a place of peace what you might want to do for the future. And of course the majority do decide to separate and to go their separate ways. And the women, well, I have known a number of wives who have then gone on to meet a heterosexual man and suddenly thought, my goodness, I now know what I've been missing all these years. I had no idea how different it would feel to be loved by a man who actually is attracted to me sexually. Their gay husbands have never been able to do that, but they didn't know anything else because of the Christian doctrine of no sex before marriage. So all these gay men are always such models of abstinence and freedom from lust before they get married, and then when they do get married, they're very unwilling, very reluctant to get involved sexually. And of course, what does that do to the wife? It makes her feel, well, what kind of a woman am I that I'm of no interest to my husband, or so little interest, and that any intimacy is something that's almost got to be begged for if it's ever going to happen at all, or it's just a marital duty that seems somehow not to have any life in it. And of course, when a woman then discovers what she's been missing, then she can forgive her husband.
What I'm picking up from a lot of your responses, Jeremy, is sexuality actually is a small aspect of this whole issue. You're talking in terms of care, compassion, Christ-likeness generally, in the way that we interact with others.
Yes, absolutely, indeed. And really, when you look at Jesus' ministry in the Gospels, he reaches out constantly to the outcasts, and he always treats them with the utmost respect, and has this amazing ability to restore the dignity of people who are otherwise outcasts. And I think that is the Christian ministry, in essence. It's reaching out to those who don't fit for one reason or another into what society wants, and in restoring their dignity and helping them to feel they do belong, they're called by God, they're loved by God, they do belong to the church, and they can find their own unique place. And fitting in with what society wants isn't really God's agenda. It's discovering who we really are that's God's agenda, who we were made to be.
Meanwhile, society in many ways has moved on in this respect. And I know people who will say, well, church or not, this is a complete non-issue. But the thing is, that theology is still very much out there in a big way. How would you advise Christian parents who may have a very conservative theology, everything cut and dry, black and white or whatever, and who may just have learned that their child is gay?
Yes, that's another very big, important pastoral area. I mean, I would try to say to them, remember your child is still your child, and you've always loved them before you discovered they were gay, and they're not a different person now, that you just discovered a bit more about them. And that discovery may be uncomfortable, but first and foremost you've got to go on loving your child and unconditionally, and informing yourself as to what this means, because not wanting your child to be gay isn't going to make them straight. If we could change other people by just wanting them to be different, life would be much simpler perhaps, but the fact is you have to discover and learn what this is about and what this means to your child, and love them for who they are. And some parents are able to do that and then change their theology later. And I've known quite a number of parents who've seen a complete change in their understanding of God as a result of accepting their children, and actually come to enjoy their Christian faith much more, I might add, when they realise how loving God is and how understanding and compassionate he is. But there are other parents who just can't do it, and they reject their children, and then they end up having lost somebody they love deeply.
And what about the children or people themselves who, like you, as you were growing up, suddenly thinking, oh my gosh, I'm gay and I'm a Christian, I'm part of a family and a church, but this doesn't compute. How do you advise them?
Well, it depends on what age I would meet them. Of course, the majority of people who come to me are well into their 20s and sometimes 30s or even older. And so, in a sense, the formative years of which one might discover one's sexuality have long passed. So really, again, it's about listening to them and letting them talk about their experiences and what their feelings, and helping them to come to terms with who they are. And really, it's a process for them. Often exposure to meeting other gay Christians helps them to, again, end the isolation and realise they're not alone, and being able to have conversations with lots of other people and discover the common strands of experience is very helpful for them. I've never known anybody really go back to thinking that they could change. They all know they couldn't. And an awful lot of people do come to me well into their 40s who spent 20 years in their churches desperately struggling not to be gay, and it often leads to such a crisis in their lives of depression and inertia and inability to cope that they feel they're losing everything. They're losing their careers, their everything else, their credibility in the churches even, and they begin to think, well, what else have I got to lose, apart from my reputation maybe? And again, embracing their sexuality as something that's God-given, and daring to believe that God loves them as they are, can completely change them around, and does so quite quickly, amazingly quickly. I went to a civil partnership a year ago of a woman in her mid-40s who was very happily now, if you like, married to her lesbian partner, and people who came to that civil partnership from her church, where she was no longer welcome as a worship leader and taking part in church life, but people who've been long-term friends just said, well, this woman has changed so much, and so much for the better. She's happy now, she's contented. We just have to recognise that this is what God's doing in her life, and accept that this is the right thing for her. So again, it's Christian witnessing at its most basic, that you see what God is doing and you speak of it, of the reality of what God's doing in changing lives. And if that reality doesn't fit our theology, then we have to look again at our theology, because we could have been wrong.